So we're coming up on the holidays, and of course part of holidays is feasting. Now feasting is very normal. It's been part of our society for generations. And so I don't think you should feel guilty about participating in the feasting, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or what have you. And you probably don't want to be a perfectionist about it and beat yourself up every time it happens or whatever. But what's not normal is what happens to a lot of us, and myself included sometimes, is where it kind of becomes this 2-month long perpetual binge, right? With just like junk food after junk food after junk food, because there's so much of it for all these different reasons. Somebody brings it to work, and then you have some event at home, and then there's some party, and then it just becomes one thing after another after another. So because this junk food, these sweets and treats and other things are very unhealthy and also very fattening, we don't want to just go completely off the rails, right? And that can be easy to do. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 actionable tips that can help you kind of limit the damage, so to speak. So instead of just using willpower, which generally doesn't work, it's better to have some biological hacks or things that make it easier to kind of avoid completely losing control, so to speak. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. And by the way, credit to Megan Ramos, because I got some of these tips from her. She was on episode 14 of my podcast, but I got some of these tips from a blog post that she wrote. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the tips. So tip number 1 is don't show up hungry. So if you're going to a party or some other event, or even like the main event, like the dinner on Thanksgiving, for example, you don't necessarily have to show up totally hungry. You could eat at least a modest amount of something very fatty a couple hours before. So that could be like bacon or an avocado. And then you're not going to crave carbs nearly as much when you arrive at the event. So again, you don't have to eat like a huge amount of whatever it is you're eating in advance, but even like a little bit of it will probably kind of take the edge off, and you won't feel like eating a million rolls or a bunch of sweets as much as you would otherwise. A similar idea would be to eat something high in fiber like chia seeds, and would help as well. And part of the reason this works is because fat and protein and fiber are very satiating, and so it's going to kind of tamp down your appetite somewhat. You'll still be able to enjoy the meal, but you won't feel as much like just going completely out of control when the time comes. So that's tip number 1, don't show up hungry. So tip number 2 is volunteer to bring a low-carb appetizer or side dish, or even a dessert potentially. So this could be something like a meat and cheese tray or guacamole, maybe with some sliced bell peppers to dip instead of chips. And there are lots of other options like Brussels sprouts wrapped in bacon, for example. And then some of those like keto desserts and things would be another kind of reasonable option. And basically, that'll give you a chance to start with something healthier versus just, a bunch of stuff that's going to spike your blood sugar and whatnot. And then by doing that, you kind of stimulate satiety, like I talked about in tip number 1, because the protein or the fat is very satiating, meaning very satisfying, and kind of helps control your appetite. So that's tip number 2, is volunteer to bring something low carb that you can start off with at the event or the meal. Tip number 3 is, if you'll be cooking all day, eat a fatty breakfast or brunch. So of course, if you've done this, if you've been the one to prepare a whole like Thanksgiving meal or some other big meal or a bunch of stuff for an event or whatever, then you know that it's tempting to kind of pick at the food throughout the day, right? And then before you know it, you've eaten the equivalent of a full meal and potentially a lot of unhealthy stuff, depending on what you're preparing and all that. But like probably it's going to add up to something that's not great. So if before you start that, you have a fatty breakfast or a fatty brunch, meaning maybe again like a bacon or an avocado or a combination, or even something high in fiber, like I mentioned earlier, like some eggs would be good for the fat and the protein, but not the fiber. The chia seeds would be good for the fiber. The avocado has a lot of fiber. So all those things. So if you get some of those kind of things in your system, then you're not going to be as tempted to pick at all the other things, especially the unhealthy stuff. So you won't be as tempted to keep snitching some of the dessert that you're making or whatever. So that's tip number 3. If you're going to be the one cooking, then do something in advance so you kind of control your appetite by eating a fatty breakfast or a fatty brunch. Tip 4 is drink a lot of water before, during, and after, so stay hydrated. So whenever we eat a whole bunch of food, especially a lot of processed stuff, then we usually get kind of dehydrated indirectly because we have so much solid stuff and not enough liquid in our system is one way to think of that. So basically, if you kind of load up on water a little bit before, during, and after, it'll help control your hunger a little bit maybe, but it'll also just help you feel a little bit better, and you'll probably just be less likely to overeat as much as you would otherwise. And we often mistake thirst for hunger, or in other words, when we're actually thirsty, sometimes we think we're hungry, and so just kind of staying ahead of that, drinking enough water to kind of stay ahead of that makes us less likely to keep kind of snacking and stuff after the meal is over as well. So that's tip number 4, stay hydrated. Tip number 5 is after a starchy meal or a sugary meal or any food like a dessert or whatever that's very sugary or starchy, do some movement, get moving. And that could be as simple as going on a walk for 5 or 10 minutes, or anything else where you do a little bit of light exercise around the house or whatever. And the reason is that'll help reduce the amount of blood sugar rise that you have. So you won't get this huge blood sugar spike like you might otherwise. It helps to kind of level that off a lot. So for example, when Dr. Ben Bickman was on my podcast in episode 18, he described how going on a walk for about 10 minutes after a sugary or starchy meal will cause a 50% decrease. So from here to here, I guess, 50% decrease in the amount of blood sugar rise that you have after that meal. So if you're going to have this big feast, go on a walk afterwards, because then if you're dealing with blood sugar issues or just for your health in general, even if you're not someone who usually gets high blood sugar, it's worth it to do something like that just to kind of keep it a little more under control. And then it'll probably get you in the right mindset where you won't be as likely to just keep binging on a bunch of junk constantly as well. All right, so here's a bonus tip. The bonus tip is avoid the all or nothing mindset. So I know this happens to me sometimes, and it happens to a lot of us around the holidays, and that is if we have a little bit of junk food, then we say, oh, well, I guess I'm not following my healthy diet, then I may as well just completely give up for the next week or the next month or whatever. So if you try to stay out of the all or nothing mindset, then you're able to be like, okay, well, I'm going to enjoy some of this food. And then after that, I'll eat something healthier later in the day, or the next day I'll do a little bit of fasting or whatever to kind of balance it out. And so instead of just going off the rails for 2 months, you're maybe able to kind of balance things out and not think that it's all or nothing. And part of that is about going easy on yourself and not beating yourself up. Because if you're just like, oh, I'm such a horrible person, and then you drown your sorrows in a tub of ice cream, right? So, so overall, if you can kind of stay out of that all or nothing mindset, you're a lot more likely to kind of be able to keep things at a reasonable, moderate pace during the holidays. As a bonus, it also makes it easier to say no to like mediocre treats. Because if you're in that all or nothing mindset, you're like, oh yeah, give me all the cookies. But if not, then you're kind of able to say, well, like those are store-bought cookies. Store-bought cookies are almost never good. I'm going to wait for the homemade stuff, and I'm going to just really focus on only things that are actually really good, that are really worth my time. So what about you? Are there any other like tips or hacks that you found to help kind of control the over binging, the extreme overeating throughout the whole holiday season? And if there's anything like that, go ahead and leave a comment below so we can take advantage and learn from your knowledge as well. And by the way, one thing that I often find motivating when it comes to controlling binging or just eating healthy in general is to understand how it can prevent certain medical problems. And I did a live stream a while back where I talked about a bunch of different medical emergencies that you can prevent through healthier eating. So actually you can find that video right here. So that's about the medical emergencies that you can prevent through like fasting and better nutrition and that sort of thing. So go ahead and check that out if you want to maybe get a little extra boost of motivation about preventing health problems through healthier eating. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.